Good morning. Good morning. I'm Jane Wales, and welcome to the Global Philanthropy Forum. I am proud to be wearing one of Liberia's first exports, post-war exports of textiles, and I want to thank all of you for helping a women's sewing cooperative in this way in Liberia. So for those who are watching us online, we'll try to save one for you. Inside your bags is a completely reusable, 100% recyclable water bottle from the Hope Water Foundation, thanks to Ruthanna Terrari. Ruthanna, are you here? So thank you so much, Ruthanna. I want to welcome you all to GPF 2010. We're a learning community of donors and social investors. We're all committed to international causes. We're strategic, and we seek results. This is a no fundraising zone, as you know, but we encourage partnership among you. So take advantage of this lunch and the 2 days and a half ahead of you for that purpose, and also take advantage of GPF Connect as a means of finding each other and finding common interests. I'm particularly, because we're here to learn from each other. We're particularly grateful to those who traveled under, over, or around volcanic ash to get to us. For those who could not, who are stranded in airports or at Heathrow or at Frankfurt Airport, we're having gatherings. Many Global Philanthropy Forum members are hosting one another to view the web streaming of this conference and to have their own discussions. So you've got company, and we'd like to welcome those who are viewing this online. They can also follow your commentary on Twitter on gpf.org using the hashtag GPF2010. So make sure that you mention us in your tweets and in your posts so that they can be a part of that conversation. Now, the plight of our stranded colleagues is a reminder that we are indeed global, and we are indeed connected to one another and to the earth that sustains. So if you didn't need a reminder of that, volcanic ash has done that for you. It's also a reminder, and the solution that we've sought is a reminder of the power of technology for good, and that's nice to be able to take advantage of that. If you're new to the Global Philanthropy Forum, you'll see that we do rely on each other in times of stress or difficulties such as this. But you'll also find that we rely on one another throughout the year as part of an informal brain trust as we develop our strategies for giving and for social investing. So do take advantage of that, not only in this conference, but throughout the year, because your colleagues are sitting right beside you. You're going to have a wonderful opportunity not only to delve into issues and interesting strategies, but also to celebrate some extraordinary actors, some on-the-ground actors who are really agents of change. And in particular, you will have an opportunity tomorrow night to celebrate the awardee of the Hilton Humanitarian Prize. We're really proud of this new partnership. The Hilton Foundation is ably led by Steve Hilton, who's here, and the Humanitarian Award has been beautifully shaped by Judith Miller and stewarded by her. And it's because of their vision and because of the vision of the Hilton Foundation that we all, and the board of directors of the Hilton Foundation, we all get an opportunity to celebrate an extraordinary agent of change tomorrow. So thank you to Steve, to Judith, and to Judy, and to the Hilton Foundation Board of Trustees. As we think about what drives social change, we're going to, in the next 2 days and a half, focus on 4 basic necessities of life: food, water, health, climate, and the interaction amongst them. And we'll think about the ways in which the lack of those necessities can fuel much larger problems, but also the ways in which creative individuals, creative techniques allow us to address them and to achieve the scale we need. We're going to start with Louise Arbour of the Crisis Group, and she's going to help us understand the interaction amongst these societal stresses on the one hand and the outbreak of civil conflict on the other. And she will connect the dots for us between what we call human security on the one hand and the security or stability of societies and of states on the other. And in subsequent panels, what we will do is we'll delve deeply into each issue area. We will treat them as discrete issue areas so that we can think about the kinds of strategies that work philanthropically, and we can think about specific examples of positive paths to take. But we're going to constantly be reminding you of the importance of thinking of the larger whole, thinking of the connections amongst those issues. So on the one hand, we want the discipline and focus of an issue focus, but on the other hand, we want to understand the larger whole. We don't want to find ourselves thinking and acting in vertical silos and failing to capture opportunities for advancing societal success. And while we are inclined as a group to think in terms of systems, to think in terms of whole problems, and you will find that in the next 2.5 days, we're motivated in the end by the particular. We're motivated in the end by the impact on individuals. And so to keep that in mind, I'm going to ask you to think about a person, a girl. In fact, I'm going to ask you to think about the young girl who is on the cover of your programs. Let's just call her Naira. She was born to a mother who died in childbirth. She suffered malnutrition as the result of lacking her mother's milk. She was therefore vulnerable to neglected infectious diseases that she was exposed to as she used a public latrine. What nourishment she had was therefore lost to diarrhea, a disease of the poor. But when she started school, Naira had access to a free meal each day, and to the promise and the opportunity to dream of a better life. But when her father's small farm failed to produce as it had in the past because of water scarcity or because of weather extremes, her father could no longer afford that tuition into the school, and she needed to be taken out and brought home to work the farm. But nonetheless, imagine Naira holding on to dreams of her own despite that, holding on to the dream of one day owning her own orchard or her own business that allows her to sell canned food. Imagine that she goes to the water, goes to retrieve water from the well, and she learns from other women of opportunities to get loans, get microloans, microfinance, both online, on their telephones, through their cell phones, to both apply for those funds and actually receive those funds in that way. And imagine that she's told by these women about literacy classes that are made available to market women. Imagine that she's got all these reasons to hold on to that hope and that sense of dream. Now, her father is probably thinking of the day where Naira will stop having foolish dreams, will recognize that it's her brother that will inherit the farm in any case, and that she's soon going to be married and going to have children of her own and going to have to gather firewood and just make do, try to find a way to struggle to survive. So the question I ask of you as you think about Naira, if you keep thinking about Naira, ask yourself the question, will she lead her mother's life and die her mother's death, or will she one day be a leader? And I would ask, as you think about the 2.5 days ahead, let's explore the options for Naira. And let's think about how each of us can help expand the options for Naira. And recall that when you invest in systemic change, you're investing in Naira's future. So please keep her in your minds. I ask you to enjoy your lunch, enjoy your neighbor, share interests, share stories, share lessons learned, and right after, I will have the opportunity to introduce you to an extraordinary leader, Louise Arbour. Enjoy. Thank you. Each time, at each annual conference, I can tell who's new to the Global Philanthropy Forum for the first 10 minutes. 20 minutes in, I can't tell. This is a truly welcoming community, and we're so glad you're all a part of it. I want to ask you to join me in welcoming our first guest, our first speaker, and that's Louise Arbour. As you know, Louise Arbour is the president and CEO of the International Crisis Group, an extraordinary organization. But prior to that, she was the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights for several years. She had previously served on Canada's Supreme Court and had served as chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and the former end of Rwanda. She's a brilliant attorney. She has devoted her remarkable career to advancing the rule of law. So please join me in welcoming Louise Arbour.
Good to see you.
Now, what we've asked Louise Arbour to do, to help us with, I should note she told me not to call her Judge Arbour, that's the American way. You don't keep your title for life in Canada. But what we've asked her to do is help us understand the interactions between violent conflict on the one hand, or the relationship, the links between violent conflict on the one hand and the interactions amongst such stresses as endemic poverty, hunger, disease, resource scarcity on the other. Could you help guide us there?
Well, I think we could all guide ourselves, in a sense, in a very intuitive way. I think it's relatively apparent without a lot of sort of research that all the stressors, particularly the very, very severe stressors that confront communities, don't necessarily, but can lead to confrontation. Well, they lead to competition, they could lead to confrontation. And then the question is, when does it then degenerate into violence, armed conflict? Sometimes it's very useful, I think, to come back to some pretty fundamental premises, and one that I always find useful, particularly having done a lot of work in human rights, is President Roosevelt's magnificent insight into the four freedoms, right? Freedom from fear, freedom from want, and then the two that so recently have been pitted against each other, freedom of expression and freedom of religion. But setting aside these two for now, I think the aspiration for freedom and security are truly universal. And so any profound stress on anything that relates to security, I think, needs to be managed. And when these stressors, I think, come from deprivation of access to pretty fundamental necessities, let's put it as a threat to freedom from want, I think it immediately activates the necessity to look at freedom from fear, because you will immediately, I think, see the interconnection between the two. Now, having said that, it's very dangerous, I think, to jump to very facile observations that, in fact, are not true when you probe a little further. Poverty is not a source of conflict. Poverty is sort of an ill or an evil in and of itself. It doesn't have to be linked to conflict. I think we have to combat it, particularly very extreme poverty. So it's not necessarily sort of deprivation as such. It's deprivation in circumstances where it cannot be properly managed. So for instance, typically, it's when you have no institutional system to manage competition, no dispute resolution mechanism that is trustworthy, that you then see, I think, competition or challenge for resources, for access to basic necessities, become a trigger of conflict. And then if I could just add, interestingly enough, we very often neglect this linkage at the other end of the process, in conflict resolution. When you see mediators sit around tables to organize peace deals, very often this question of equitable access to the distribution of wealth is not on the table. And the actors that would be the promoters of these issues, civil society actors, women's groups, are notoriously absent from peace negotiations. So you see peace deals that deal with freedom from fear or an entire kind of political structure, constitutional reform, security sector reform, and very little attention paid to alleviating freedom from want.
There, as High Commissioner for Human Rights, it was your charge to advance the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And part of that Universal Declaration is to argue that folks, that individuals do have a right to these necessities of life. As a practical matter, this relates to state capacity, though. So how is that operationalized, and who's the guarantor of those kinds of rights?
Well, actually, this is really quite interesting. If you look at the Universal Declaration, it's true that it contains all rights, so basically the fundamental doctrine of equality, non-discrimination, and then what are called civil and political rights on the one hand, and then economic, social, and cultural rights on the other. And 20 years after the Universal Declaration, in the 60s, it gave rise to a fracture, basically, of this bundle of rights with the creation of the two international covenants. So there's an international covenant on civil and political rights ratified by the United States and by most Western countries. And then there's an international covenant on economic, social, and cultural rights ratified by China and championed now by many developing countries. Now, the West, and certainly the United States, but Western countries generally, have not been very enthusiastic about treating, for instance, the right to health, the right to food, the right to shelter, the right to education as fundamental rights, but have treated them most as the kind of the byproduct of healthy market economies. It will all come in due course if we have a healthy economic system. I think this has been proven somewhat difficult. and at the same time, and don't get me wrong, I think that many in the developing world are advancing this argument, not always in good faith, but claim to champion economic and social rights, and they believe that civil and political rights are in fact a luxury that will come only after the basic rights have been guaranteed. In my view, both extremes are misguided. All rights, I think, should come in a package of universal, indivisible entitlements. Now, the fact that they can only be incrementally implemented doesn't change their fundamental nature as entitlements. Not simply the object of, you don't have to deserve it. You don't have to deserve to be educated. You don't have to deserve to be fed. But you're entitled to it.
And presumably it's in a state's interest in any event to have a healthy and educated population. But whether it makes those investments is another matter.
That's right. And it's not necessarily viewed by some leaders as being in their state interest. If you can have a sufficiently authoritarian regime to control any form of rebellion, then it's a matter of total indifference, it would appear, to many leaders as to whether their populations benefit from their governments.
And back to the notion of who is the guarantor, what is the role of private actors, of nonprofits and for-profit organizations in advancing these kinds of opportunities, this access to these basic necessities of life?
Well, I think it's an increasing role being played by civil society, which also explains how I find myself in this job after having worked mostly all my professional life very much inside institutions. And with a little distance, when I look at it, it seems to me that if you look at the history of the trajectory of philanthropy, first of all, you have to look at America because it's the only place where you see such a robust form of civic engagement. But if you look at it I think historically, civil society actors in partnership with philanthropy had very rapidly found their place, in fact, occupied a very large place in education, in the arts, in all kinds of cultural activities, in health, in sports. And then gradually, we've seen an interest in looking more globally, international issues. And that led also, I think, to human rights engagement, humanitarian engagement. I mean, if you looked in Darfur, for I think every 10 actor on the ground, 9 were NGO actors delivering services and so on. But the last field in which I think philanthropists, in line with civil society actors, are currently becoming engaged is this question of peace and security. This, we had always surrendered that to state actors, not with great success if you look at Rwanda or the former Yugoslavia, 2 areas that I know particularly well. But the general sense was international peace and security is for states. It's a conversation between states. And I think what we now see increasingly is that states pursue national interest. It may sound very pretentious, but I believe that civil society actors who really, I think, believe in advancement of all other issues have to make themselves the champions of an international public interest, not just a convergence of, or a competition of national interest. And I think this is where, this may have come to me when I was in court. Large part of my career, I was in the Canadian court system, and interveners were hugely instrumental in the advancement of legal issues. And by interveners, I mean Aboriginal rights group, a women's group, who formed in the last 20, 25 years these kinds of single issue lobbies and took their issues to the court as civil society actors promoting a public interest. And I think we've seen it in consumer protection, for instance, not leaving it to government, really championing cause as a voice from civil society. And this is what I think we're now seeing penetrate the international peace and security field.
And the whole concept of interest underlies a lot of questions regarding governance. So we will get back to that. Many of us have focused on post-conflict situations, post-conflict reconciliation, post-conflict reconstruction, and the whole notion of provision of services after much of an infrastructure has been decimated. As you look at countries that have emerged from crisis or conflict, that are heavily reliant on the kinds of relief organizations that many philanthropists support, Mercy Corps, CARE, Oxfam, and others, Save the Children. How do states go about the transition from relief to economic development, to standing on their own? How is that managed?
Well, I think a lot of it, obviously there are all kinds of economic initiatives that have to be put in place, but I think a lot of it has to be done also through political engagement. You know, I think historically, again, service providers, or what I would call humanitarian actors in post-conflict, have operated under these doctrines of neutrality and impartiality and independence, which, in my view, is not inconsistent with political awareness and advocacy for change. Which doesn't mean, you know, taking side between local political actors, but it means being very sophisticated in understanding the political environment in which one operates, exactly for that reason, so as not to become instrumentalized in doing what the state is not interested in doing, and then perpetuating, in part, a dependency, and in part, a huge deficiency in the state discharging its obligations to its population. So I think what is important is to have these partnerships of humanitarian actors and more like either political activists, but to engage government in the taking responsibility for delivery of some services. In addition to that, I think what we come to realize, but not always very explicitly, if you look at the Eastern Congo now, which is attracting a lot of attention, very rightly so, humanitarian actors or civil society activists can go in there, and usually you're not going to find a lot of resistance from the government. You could go a long way in opening clinics and opening hospitals and opening schools, but you can't open courts. This is the preserve of state action. I mean, there's a limit. There are some areas of service delivery that are intrinsic in state action, anchored in the rule of law, and so I think we also have to recognize that. And the answer is not to neglect these services, but it's to make sure that others engage the government in delivering these absolutely essential services.
But so much of this relates to state capacity in the end. And so as you think about the philanthropic interventions, well, let me just take the area of public health. We tend to, or much of the activity in the public health arena is very disease specific, much of the work. And it isn't always about building an infrastructure, sort of health system strengthening, so that when that one disease is addressed, the population is not vulnerable to the next disease that comes along. How important is it for philanthropy to be focused on building a core capacity going forward rather than addressing an immediate problem alone?
Well, again, it seems to me that it's really important to be very balanced in all these activities. And we should not neglect the absolutely dire situations of people who need immediate assistance with no conditionality, nothing else attached but food delivery and the provision of very basic, immediate, urgent assistance. So, and I think we should never walk away from that as though this was futile or not sufficient good investment into the future. But having said that, there's no question that capacity building is really fundamental. If I come back to issues in which I'm engaged, I'm also, on the other hand, very wary of the whole terminology of capacity building. Because before you start building capacities, you should have a very, very sophisticated diagnosis of what the incapacities are or what the deficiencies are. And if it's a deficiency of political will, or if you're dealing with a government that has no interest in the well-being of its own people, or who engages, as we've seen, I think, in a lot of conflict zones, a government that is a facilitator or at times complicit on displacement of internal populations, sexual violence, killings, and so on, of its own people, then building capacity, in fact, is a very risky enterprise. You're facilitating more bad things. So I think we need to be extremely tough in having our eyes open, never shying away from this kind of immediate, critical, life-saving assistance, but also engaging in capacity buildings where I think this money and all this energy comes in to support real shortages of capacity and do not empower more exactions or do not further facilitate. A good example is police training, security sector reform, and so on. There's no point building the capacity of a police force by giving them equipment if all the evidence is that they're going to use it totally inappropriately, including by killing civilians. Right? That's, I think, where it's really important to come in any kind of environment in a very sophisticated fashion.
But to provide the kind of training that helps them understand how to operate within a civilian population may be useful.
Yes,
with the basic norms. You're kind of taking us to the whole notion of responsibility to protect, which is so much a part of the International Crisis Group's history. Say something about not only the obligations of states to their publics to protect them against the kind of mass atrocities that you're suggesting, but say something about what one does. What is the role of the international community when a state does fail to meet those obligations? Willfully fails to meet those obligations, in fact.
Well, under the doctrine of the responsibility to protect, you may recall that the doctrine articulates what in my view is relatively self-evident, which is that states have the primary responsibility to protect their own people, certainly against genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes. my opinion, they also have the same responsibility to protect their people against famine, disease, malnutrition, but that's outside the doctrine as presently conceived. We're really focusing, maybe just as a first step, but as this obligation to protect people against genocide, crimes against humanity. That's the heart of the doctrine. Now, the doctrine then goes on to articulate that if a state is unwilling or unable to discharge that responsibility, it passes on to the international community. Now, that's the part that's always been seen as very problematic. It had the same flavor, or it has the same flavor, to those states who think that they may be targeted by this international intervention, the flavor of the doctrine of the right to intervene, right? Humanitarian intervention. So it's met with a lot of resistance, a lot of suspicion that this could be activated by those who may have a self-interest in intervening. So at the end of the day, I think the first part of the doctrine is relatively, I think would be very difficult for any state to resist. Most of them, in fact, have undertaken these responsibility by signing all kinds of conventions. The Genocide Convention is widely ratified. So the part that is problematic in the views of some is this question of what is the responsibility of the international community to intervene when there's a default, either lack of will or lack of capacity by a government.
But when it comes to operationalizing that, when it comes to, even if we have the political will to intervene, do we have the mechanisms at hand to do so? That is to say, are there collective security regimes, such as the African Union, that really have the core capacity to step up to cope with a situation like that? And whose responsibility is it to strengthen that capacity if it doesn't exist now?
Well, I think even though we tend to jump immediately, the minute we talk about a state that is unwilling or unable to protect its own population, we tend to jump immediately to the Security Council ordering military intervention. Now, of course, there's a whole range of probably much more realistic forms of intervention that are much more helpful. I think I could give you two examples. First, I believe that regional actors are the most relevant ones. That is, states pay attention to their immediate neighbors before they feel engaged vis-a-vis the United Nations or the broader international community. One good example was Cyclone Nargis in Burma, Myanmar, where I think without the very effective effort by ASEAN to engage, it might have been almost impossible for international assistance to be deployed. And I don't think there's anybody else that could have had this capacity to engage with a government that was extremely suspicious of international intentions, as you know, and very resistant to opening up to any form of assistance. So the immediate success, I think, was triggered by ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, that were an appropriate interlocutor for this government. The same way, I think, in the recent, last fall, coup in Guinea, not an issue that attracted a huge amount of international attention, but a very, very, very threatening coup by a military actor in an army that had different fighting factions, and then a massacre in a stadium. ECOWAS, once again, even before the African Union, a regional set of political actors were very effective in stepping in and engaging and curtailing what could have turned out to be really catastrophic results. So I think the empowerment in the political arena, the empowerment of regional actors is currently, I think, the most effective way.
We started out by talking about the links between the outbreak of violent conflict on the one hand and the interactions amongst these various societal stresses on the other. And I think you've reinforced the notion that that the causes of war, the sources of war, are many. That there doesn't tend to be a singular cause. Is that a fair statement?
Well, in a nutshell, you could say it's very contextual. Each case, I think, there's no template. Each conflict has its own little history and sets of triggers. And
part of the International Crisis Group's role is to play a predictive role. That is to say, to follow certain stresses and to see where the next outbreak of violence might occur and how one can intervene to prevent that. What are the various factors that you follow so that you consider to be indicators of sufficient stress that if they come together could lead to violent conflict?
Well, again, we never work in a kind of thematic way, and we don't have a sort of pre-existent checklist of, the way International Crisis Group has always developed is that we are essentially field-based. We work from the field up. And it's only with a little distance, sometimes we sort of look over our shoulders and we could say, make some observations. For instance, surprisingly maybe, but I think it's becoming more and more apparent, one of the biggest triggers of violence is elections. Not any elections, but elections in situations where governance is mediocre and where the rules are either not well articulated or not applied. It becomes, so something that is viewed as a public good in any functioning democracy, when it's activated in an environment that is already very fragile, where people are armed, where the system is very corrupt, where there's going to be a lot of cheating, all of a sudden the electoral process in and of itself is a very alarming potential cause of further conflict and violence. So I think we see certain things, but as I said, most of it is hugely contextual. It's often opportunistic. It depends a lot on personalities. So the key is to get the local politics right, to really understand. Crisis Group published, warning that the conflict in Georgia, in the two aspiring to autonomy regions of Georgia, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, was likely to flare up. Not too clear which one would flare up first, in what order, but we knew that within months there was sufficient tension and agitation and opportunities for mischief by external actors and so on, that something could happen. Now, and in those cases, we do become very prescriptive. We try to identify what is it that could be done that could diffuse, that could engage others, that could diffuse the tension. But as I said, it's very difficult to extract a lot of generalities. Maybe the most useful insight generally, if we look at the very big picture on conflict, which in a sense also the most encouraging one, is we've all noticed, I think, a huge reduction in the number of armed conflicts since the end of the Cold War. And not just of interstate conflict, but even of internal armed conflict. A very dramatic reduction. Then a very dramatic reduction in the number of casualties of combatants, of people directly associated with conflict, and also a reduction in the number of indirect victims of conflict. Now, those historically were not very well measured. People who die of disease and malnutrition because they've been living in camps and so on as a result of conflict. But even as we measure all that, we see that, in fact, it's very encouraging. There is a reduction. The Human Security Report in particular that has looked at these studies, they attribute, which is, I think, encouraging for all of us, this reduction not only to the different international politics in the Security Council, fewer proxy wars between the great powers and so on. All this played a part, but they say the most important factor in that is the overall engagement of the international community, both politically through the increase in peacekeeping and peace-building missions by the UN, and this enormous growth of civil society, international civil society engagement. The old protection by presence, like being there, bearing witness, speaking out, and then advocacy, mass mobilization. That whole series of activities, a huge contributor.
And how important is the role of the nonprofit sector in, for example, early warning?
Oh, I think it's really critical. The problem with early warning is that you can't just stop there. The canary in the mine shaft, the canary dies, so that's not a very good analogy. I like to think we're a very resilient canary in the mine shaft, the one that whistles but then manages to survive. So I think early warning, I think, has to be this is what crisis group is devoted to, is the hardest part. It's not just to get the analysis right. Well, first of all, to get the facts right, to be very rigorous, to speak to everybody, to be very contextual, get the politics right, spell it all out. But then it's to be prescriptive, and not prescriptive as in they should all get along. I mean, that again is not particularly helpful. Prescriptive, what should happen next week? And so short term, medium term, longer term, and to have recommendations addressed to specific actors. Not the international community should engage. Well, that's not also very, very helpful. To try to break down who are the ones likely to be able to have an impact, to make a difference, and then to press them.
Some of the things that happen pre-conflict then rear their heads again post-conflict. I mean, I'll give you a for instance, and you correct me if I'm wrong, please. But frequently there's a situation in which access to basic services and resources is denied to marginalized groups, sometimes ethnic groups that are out of favor, women and children, but groups. Then once the conflict is resolved, if it is resolved, frequently those very people are the people last in line to get the services once again. How do you change that dynamic in the post-conflict setting? Even in the setting of refugee camps, how do you change that dynamic?
Well, for one thing, I think first of all, you have to be aware of it, that an unjust peace is not likely to be very sustainable. I said earlier we should be very wary about just saying, poverty is a cause of conflict. It's not poverty, it's inequities, it's grievances that are unaddressed. So the most marginalized groups are usually also the ones who are not represented in peace negotiations, whose interests will never be properly addressed. And again, we have to have our eyes wide open when we talk about marginalized groups. For the most part, they are unpopular groups. We don't have to look very far. I think in our own societies, when we look at, if there's a scarcity of public goods, a scarcity of money, they typically don't go first to prisoners. Usually, they're not the number one community who will get the benefit of, say, an increase in state revenue. So if you transpose that metaphor, that's exactly the same thing you see, I think, in conflict situations, especially in societies that have a long, culturally ingrained, discriminatory set of practices. In Nepal, for instance, a country that I think has attracted, and rightly so, quite a lot of philanthropic engagement and so on, you have historically these long marginalized castes and groups that have to be empowered and brought to the table when you move forward.
You used the word resilience about four or 5 minutes back. Going back to the linkages, I think about Haiti, where the interaction between poverty on the one hand, environmental degradation on the other, made each exacerbate the other and then result in a considerably less resilient society when a crisis occurred. We have a lot of warning of that. Mm-hmm. What is the responsibility both of the international community, official community, but also of the NGO and philanthropic worlds when we can see that interaction occurring that is reducing societal resilience in the end?
Well, again, in Haiti, poverty, environmental degradation were apparent for a long time. So was also a very impoverished form of governance. Right? A very inequitable society, the dominance of a political class that was not delivering to those who needed the most. Now, we cannot obscure that reality, particularly if we try to turn this catastrophic event into a kind of reconstruction opportunity. It's also, I think, time to challenge these political classes into reconstructing also under a rule of law that has all the fundamental principles of participation, participation by all, representation of marginalized group, empowerment of women, all these factors that I think will reconstruct a more just society, will make it much more sustainable than having better building codes to sustain the next earthquake.
You speak about good governance going in. Let's think about it coming out in a crisis situation. Let's take Bangladesh in the face of climate change, a situation where you can imagine snowcaps melting, seas rising, resulting in mass migrations, resulting in disease outbreaks, et cetera, and the problem of Bangladesh's neighbors not having the capacity to manage that outcome. What are the sort of the international governance challenges that are ahead of us, the challenge of managing a shared problem, and what's preventing us from being well prepared?
Well, I think that's exactly, I mean, you talk about management of these problems. I think that's exactly what we need to build. I mean, if you think of, you just imagine as a case scenario, what would be the difference in the outcome of a severe water shortage in California and in Yemen? Now, you could say, well, in Yemen, it would already affect a society that is very poor and therefore would be further impoverished, and so the results would be very catastrophic. But if you start really working the comparison, you immediately will come to conclude that they will be certainly better planning, there'll be better warning, better planning, better institutional capacity to respond, and to manage the competition that will come to access to scarce resources, say in North America, than it would in a country first that is hugely dependent, first of all, on its own water resources, and that has very, very weak institutions even to deal with the day-to-day management of state affairs, and therefore it's not going to have a lot of ability to deal with crisis management. And on top of it, very weak regional infrastructure, relationships with neighbors that are problematic at best. So when Yemen runs out of water, which it will, I was there 2 weeks ago, I spent time with the Minister of Water Resources, and I mean, I don't think that's a state secret. I mean, he said the only thing that we cannot predict with any great accuracy is whether we're going to run out in 2 years or in 20, not 200. That's not in the picture. I mean, the depletion of the water table is extremely severe. Now, you can already tell what that's going to do. It's going to do all kinds of things, but it certainly most likely will increase the flow of economic migration out of the country. There's not a lot of places to go. The most immediate one is Saudi Arabia. So you don't have, if California were to run out of water, not that I want to suggest that, but presumably it could have a conversation with Canada. May not be very successful, but you could.
It probably depends on how we managed other conversations with Canada.
Exactly. Well, if you look at the management of the water resources in the St. Lawrence River and the Great Lakes, our Great Lakes, not the Great Lakes region of Africa, I mean, again, you can have confidence that for all the acute competition, tensions, sources of irritation and so on, they would be capacity for intelligent planning, enforcement of plans, cooperative mechanisms. So the building of institutional capacity, national institutional capacity for planning and for dispute resolutions of all kinds, and regional mechanisms of the same order. Central Asia had water resource management capacity under the Soviet Union. This institutional framework has now been severely eroded just at a time where water management crisis might emerge. So the tendency is to say, oh, that's all the stuff for states. I mean, these are state-to-state type conversation or issues. The same way we always felt international peace and security is for states. I think we have now civil society actors who are sufficiently knowledgeable, sophisticated, engaged, and have the backbone of enough philanthropic money to step up in these conversations and say, hasn't served us all that well to completely retreat from these issues that are political, institutional, but they are absolutely critical.
Are you expecting more resource wars in the future as we deal with scarcity of land, scarcity of water, or are you seeing examples where managing this competition is resulting. I mean, examples right now where managing the competition is resulting in cooperation instead.
Frankly, I think we're at a point where in many regions it could go either way. With the right actors and the right impetus, this could become an opportunity for creation of cooperative management issues. With the right leadership I think it could go both ways. But if it's further neglected and it becomes too late to have the appropriate mechanisms in place, not only, I think, will it be a driver of future conflict, but we're particularly poorly equipped. I mean, if I come back to my original metaphor of freedom from fear and freedom from want, if you look at the issue of migration, which will be inevitably linked, I think, to all climate change potential issues, we are very well equipped to deal with the effects of what I would call political migration. The Refugee Convention is a very robust instrument to protect people who are the victims of political persecution and have to leave their countries. And it has imposed a whole series of obligations on the whole world to take care of them, these people who basically are on the move as a result of kind of political persecution. That's the global model. In contrast to that, we have virtually no international framework, serious international framework, to look at economic migration, forced economic migration, these people who are on little boats coming out of Africa trying to enter Europe, and all the migration flow that will be attributable to environmental degradation, which is not political in nature. I mean, again, if you come back to a human rights framework, the only international human rights instrument that no Western country, none, has ratified is the International Convention on the Protection of Migrant Workers and Members of Their Families. So you still see that blockage when it comes to international cooperative mechanisms to deal with tomorrow's challenges, not yesterday's challenges. Those, we've got the structures in place, and they're not perfect, but they work, and they give us a framework. This is the time, I think, also to have a lot of engagement in articulating the connections between the environmental challenges to our planet, but also the challenges that it poses to our interconnectedness as citizens of the world.
Yeah, one of the questions I was going to ask you is who's responsible for the long term? I mean, that seems to be the challenge to the philanthropic community, because when neither the private nor the public sector is, I mean, they both suffer from short-termism.
Yeah, well, this is what when I told you earlier, we may be very pretentious to think that we feel that we're the guardians of an international public interest. What is in this basket of international public interest? It seems to be, it's exactly the things that, for all its merit, democratic governance is hostage to electoral cycles, and they tend to be very short. And because of that, it's extremely difficult to develop even the most enlightened leadership to be able to project very long term. I mean, the rhetoric is all there, what we're going to leave to our grandchildren. But when people run for office, I'm telling you, they're not too worried about their grandchildren. So these are the inherent, I think, shortcomings of democratic processes, and so is the private sector. So this is where I think, again, we can really try to encourage, it's like, as I said, consumer protection, public interest litigation 20, 25 years ago was exactly that. It was doing what states should have been doing, but for which either political considerations didn't make it very attractive, or the cause wasn't big enough, there was not enough of a constituency. So in a sense, I think the whole movement of consumer protection, of the rise of feminism, protection of minority rights, all this came through the impetus of civil society actors aided by philanthropists, a pooling of talent, energy, commitment, and money. And now the big challenge is to do it large scale, globally, and taking on issues that it's too tempting to surrender to state actors.
I'm going to alert you to, let's try to take two questions. So as you raise your hand, I'm going to ask two final questions as the mic gets to Mark and others. First is Louise, that years ago, the CIA took a look at state failure which may be a better, a larger worry right now than actually violent conflict, organized violent conflict. And they found that what states that had failed had in common were just two things. One was a closed economy, and the other was a high infant mortality rate. Are there causal links, or are these proxies for failure of a state to meet basic needs?
Well, I think on these two issues, but I think you could take a whole range of factors and ask, it's a cause and effect. Is the same thing with extreme poverty. Is it caused by conflict, or does it cause conflict? And this is not linear. I mean, we're, I think, in this kind of vicious or either virtuous circle of reinforcing one another. So I don't think you could take a single factor and say this is clearly the cause or the consequence, but I think it's part of the package.
Thank you. Mark, Hannes.
Thank you. Hi. My name is Mark Hannes. I'm with Genocide Intervention Network. I really appreciate your comments. Thank you for that. And I wanted to dig a little bit deeper and get some of your feedback on why do you think the human rights community is not more aggressive politically, or why are we stunting our potential to get more political when you talk about not caring about their grandchildren when they're running for office? When we look at the human rights sector, we see two main groupings, the operational NGOs that Jane listed, or we see the field research and analysis, ICG, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty. So, and these people have people in DC, but why don't we have a human rights pack like Sierra Club, like Move On, APAC, NRA, that are using people's money, going to house parties or campaigns, and being more aggressive in the political arena to see more change in human rights? And if not, do you think there should be one?
Should we take one more question? Is there one more? Susan, real quick, and then we'll let you field them both. Susan Davis.
Hi, Susan Davis from BRAC. I was just wondering if you could bring out your crystal ball for Sudan and the elections and suggest now what the philanthropic community and political pact should be doing about the upcoming elections.
Thank you.
All right, well, maybe I'll take Sudan. It's very specific and it's been on my mind. Crisis Group has published in the last few months 3 reports on Sudan. The last one, the elections actually closed, the polls closed yesterday on the national elections. We produced a report about 10 days ago in which we said it doesn't matter how well it goes on elections day, it's rigged right from the beginning. The census was totally unacceptable. The registration, particularly in IDP camps, was less than 10%. All the damage has already been done. So even if there, and we didn't know at that point, even if there's not mass violence or evidence of massive fraud during the polling days, which were spread over several days, this election process is very flawed. Now, this was a very unpopular thing to say by many who I would consider sort of having the same political objectives, or the same objectives, as we would advocate, which is the implementation of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement in the Sudan, which ultimately has to lead, at the latest next January, to the holding of a referendum on the secession of the South. Now, this referendum, it is critical that the referendum take place, that it take place in appropriate circumstances, that contingency plans be, sophisticated contingency plans be articulated right now for the post-referendum landscape that we're going to find in that country or in these 2 countries. And currently, the best prediction would be that the secession referendum would be successful. So even those, well, in fact, many who believe that this is important said we should be quiet about the elections because we're going to spoil the referendum. I believe it's really important to tell the truth. It's really important. Even though it complicates the political analysis and the next step, you cannot move on the basis, particularly on something as important as talking about a democracy, a country that is embarking in a democratic project. You can't say this set of elections is good enough. You have to call it for what it is, but still move on to the next step, which I think has to be clearly support for the referendum. this is not to speak of the fact that not only have people of Darfur been cheated, essentially collectively, of their right to vote, never mind elsewhere in the north, but they don't have a peace agreement yet. So this is, the Darfur peace agreement has still never been finalized between the warring faction, and now they've gone through an electoral process that they could rightly view as a charade, which will not, I think, facilitate or be particularly conducive to the finalization of a Darfur peace agreement. But still, I think, you know, again, I was saying to my colleague the other day, it's like when your GPS is telling you, recalibrating. What can I tell you? We had advocated that the election's been postponed. They haven't been postponed. They've taken place. They don't look too good. But I can't rewrite history. The question is, all right, so now we recalibrate. We're still out there on the ground, and we're going to try to articulate what is the best step forward. What should all actors do to accompany this process so that we don't betray the comprehensive peace agreement, in which 5 years ago, Southerners were given this solemn undertaking by the international community that they would have the right, 5 years from then, to express themselves on their right to self-determination. If we betray that and we try to fix the result or try to avoid going through the process altogether, what kind of credibility are we going to have when we try to be the guarantors of any other peace deal? So I think in Sudan, the political stakes are very high, and the level of engagement has to remain very firm, very solid, very frank, very honest. And this is not the time to walk away from Sudan or to pretend that it now has given birth to a great democracy and we should all move on. Now, as to the mobilization of human rights actors, I think part of the issue is that the human rights menu is so vast that it's very difficult to mobilize, to bring everybody under the same tent, which is why I think the best you could hope for is mobilization, you know, for the prevention of genocide, or you can try to re-energize to give real life to the convention, the torture convention. You could mobilize on the implementation of economic and social rights. You could get just on the anti-discrimination agenda. And on that one, you will never be able to mobilize internationally, for instance, on the prohibition of discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation or sexual preference or sexual identity, not if you're looking for African partners or for partners in the Middle East. So I think the idea of a massive worldwide mobilization on all human rights issues is very, very difficult because there are just so many tensions, even within the human rights community. So I think in the end, we're most likely to continue to see Western human rights activists and Western governments champion rights that are not too challenging to them, although they're challenging enough, that is civil and political rights. And we'll see the developing world, as I say, purport to, sometimes in good faith, sometimes less so, embrace rights that they say are easier for them to implement.
Will you be able to stay on a bit for more questions after?
Yes, absolutely.
That'd be wonderful. Let me just say a word. Louise Arbour is not only an extraordinary intellectual leader and an extraordinary doer in these related fields, but she leads a remarkable and necessary organization, International Crisis Group. So I urge you, when you go online, to click on this panel, this plenary session, and you will be driven over to the Crisis Group's website. And I urge you to make use of the knowledge that is generated, because this is an organization that is doing real good. So thank you so much, Louise Arbour. Thank you. Thank you so much. Now, I think what we're going to do is that I'm going to do a song and dance while they bring up some chairs. We're moving now from a conversation about the interaction amongst problems to a conversation about the interaction amongst potential solutions. And so what we're asking folks to do in this next session, maybe I should give you 5 minutes to stretch, but then, so stand up and stretch. and I'll call you to order in 5 minutes. So it's only 5 minutes.